Can you hear me at all? Is that better? No? How about that? Is that better? Okay. I want to thank Cindy Schwartz for inviting me back to talk with this group. I was here about 18 months ago. Is there anybody here who suffered through that first? Gosh, and you came back? Okay. It's all right. All right, you'll notice that doesn't look like the official title, and I thought about it, and this topic of the national debt, the origins, magnitude, and prospects for repayment, I thought about it, and I realized that it rang a bell with me. It goes back to a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, and in this letter he used this phrase. He asked this question: does the earth belong to the living or to the dead? Thank you. And here is my hope. I hope that what I tell you tonight will change the way you perceive our national debt. I know that everyone here in attendance, they're not watching the Cowboys, they're here. So they are very concerned about what's happening in our country. And of course, one of the most visible signs of what's happening is the growth in the national debt. And I may say some things here tonight that make you a little uneasy or maybe even hurt your feelings. But I think that in order for us to move forward, to come up with a way to really deal with these problems, we have to first understand the truth about them and just let the chips fall where they may. So that's what I hope to do. So I guess you could say my goal here is summarized by hope and change. We're hoping for a change in November. So the questions I wanted to explore with you briefly tonight are threefold. First, I wanted to look at the roots, the historical roots of our debt. I wanted to take a fresh look at the magnitude of the debt that we face. And then finally, I want us to look at the prospects for repayment of that debt. So let's begin first with the roots. And after we cover these three questions, I hope we have time to draw some broader implications for the whole realm of economic issues that we see discussed in the newspaper and in the TV. So let's start with the historical roots. First, let's talk about the financing of the debt. We're basically talking about the interaction between the Federal Reserve System, which you know is run by Ben Bernanke right now, and the United States Treasury. And the Federal Reserve acts as the fiscal agent for our Treasury, which in English means that they are the Treasury's banker. So the Treasury's job is to make sure that the revenues are accounted for, to make sure that the outlays are made that are approved by Congress on the schedule that Congress has mandated. And if there's any difference between the inflow of revenues and the outflow that is expected over each week, then they contact the Federal Reserve to borrow the money necessary to finance that deficit. So the first thing that we need to bear in mind is that whenever there is a shortfall between revenues and anticipated outlays, we call that the deficit, of course. But this assessment is made every week, and every time there is a deficit, which is pretty consistent now, that means we have to borrow. So the relationship between the deficit and the debt, of course, is that every deficit has to be financed by borrowing, and every act of borrowing adds to the debt. Now, this financing of the debt, this borrowing of the money occurs every Monday. Federal Reserve Bank in New York goes in the open market and offers United States Treasury bonds to the world's investors. The investors pay basically by writing checks on their accounts. Checks are deposited into the Treasury's account at the Federal Reserve Bank, And those deposits, along with the tax revenues that are transferred in there each week, then give the Treasury enough money to make the outlays, write the checks that have to be written. All checks coming from the U.S. Treasury are written on Federal Reserve deposits. So that's sort of a brief review of the mechanics that are involved. Now, one of the other things to remember as far as what's happening now is that this contract that the Treasury is making with the buyers of the bonds, and I know that having thought about this national debt situation, you understand that I'm using the word bond here in a very broad sense, because Treasury obligations come in as short a maturity as 91 days, and they run all the way out to 30 years, so you can take your pick. But for simplicity purposes, I'm just going to use the word bond. Okay? When I say bond, I mean a Treasury obligation of some type. So there are two parts to the contractual obligation that the Treasury enters into with an investor. First obligation, on the schedule stated on the bond, we agree to pay you interest at whatever rate we agreed to at the time the bond was sold. Second part of the contractual promise is that when the contract ends, and that is also stated on the face of the instrument, we call that the maturity date. Whenever the bond matures, we'll give you your money back. So those are the two elements of the contract. Now, for the first 100 and roughly 40 years of our nation's history, as the interest was being paid, and they only pay interest. It's not like you and I paying off a car where part of each payment is interest and part of it is the return of the money we borrow. They don't do that. They just pay interest. So as they went along in the first 140 years of our history, the Secretary of the Treasury would set aside part of current tax revenues into a special account, such that when the bonds matured, he had enough money in this account to basically write a check and redeem the bond. But that's not how we do it today. We don't use a sinking fund as we used to use. So what do we do when the bond matures? Well, we call the Federal Reserve and we say, hey, we've got some bonds coming up next week, so we want you to go in the open market Monday and borrow a little more money so that we can pay off the old bonds. So basically what we're doing is the same thing that a person who's overextended on their credit card would do. Every so often, in addition to making the minimum payment, every so often they would switch their card balance from one bank to another because they're over their head and they can't possibly repay the loan. Now, the title that you see up here, Does the Earth Belong to the Living or to the Dead? Here's the letter that contained this statement. It was dated September 6, 1789. Then I say the earth belongs to each of these generations during the course fully and in its own right. The second generation receives it clear of the debts and encumbrances of the first. Yeah, there you go. The second from the first, the third from the second, and so on. For if the first could charge the second with a debt, then the earth would belong to the dead and not to the living. No generation can contract debts greater than may be paid during the course of its own existence, end quote. Now, the last statement seems to be a statement of fact, and yet I've just told you that's not how it works today. But I think if you understand that Jefferson was making a moral observation, he was saying morally, one generation cannot saddle another generation with its debts. Or another way of putting that is that, do we, the living, have the moral authority to saddle the unborn generation with obligations we incur in order to finance benefits for ourselves? And the answer to that clearly is no. Now, early Treasury secretaries faithfully adhered to this moral proposition that Jefferson established. As you know, Alexander Hamilton was the nation's first Treasury Secretary. The new nation had absorbed the debts of the colonies that they incurred in financing the Revolutionary War, and so it was the job of the new Treasury Secretary to pay those debts off, and he did so by using a sinking fund we discussed a minute ago. World War I, we incurred a tremendous amount of debt in financing World War I, and our Treasury Secretary at that time was Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon observed that the foundation of debts was represented by taxation. He was simply saying that the strength upon which we borrow is represented by the taxes that our people pay. He was saying we're going to use taxes to pay off the debt. But again, we stopped doing that after about 140 years. Now, every once in a while, we have to introduce a bill to raise the debt ceiling. And that brings forth the discussion of the word default. So it might be a good idea to just briefly review the legal implications or legal definitions of what constitutes a default. Okay. There are three possible things that could trigger the word default here. First, failure to pay interest on time, failure to pay the bond off when it matures, or third, paying off a bond with either worthless currency or offering the investor a currency different from the one that he originally gave you when he bought the bond. Either one of those could technically be said to qualify a default or to define a default. Now, we've defaulted before. We mentioned Andrew Mellon a while ago. When they were selling Treasury bonds to finance World War I, these issues of bonds were known then as Liberty bonds. The first two issues were not well received, and so they had a lot of bonds left over, and that means they were short of money. So the Treasury conferred with the Congress, and the Congress gave its approval to put a sweetener in the third issue of bonds, and that sweetener was the option that the holder of the bond had to ask for gold coins upon redemption. So he could take the paper money or he could take the gold coins. That issue sold out immediately because of the confidence that gave the investors. Unfortunately for the investors, this issue of bonds, in case you want to look it up, was a 1918 issue, paid 4.25%, and matured on April 15, 1934. What intervened between the time the bonds were sold and the time they matured, of course, was the coming to office of FDR, and one of the things he got Congress to do in a 1933 joint resolution was to prohibit the private holding of gold in the United States. So here you have 1934, the investors' bonds mature, they present the bonds for payment, they demand the gold coins, the Treasury says, nope, can't do that anymore. Well, you promised, I know we promised, that was then, this is now. So they sued. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that the bondholders were out of luck. Now, here's what the opinion said. This is Justice Stone, quote, "As much as I deplore this refusal to fulfill the solemn promise of bonds of the United States, I cannot escape the conclusion that the government, through exercise of its sovereign power, has rendered itself immune from liability." You ought to look this decision up. Perry versus U.S., 1935.